we are experiencing it now. We are experiencing the transition between a democracy and a really hollowed out democracy that's becoming a mask for authoritarianism. This, unfortunately, is typical, and it's part of the authoritarian playbook. Trump operates the same way that authoritarian right-wing leaders across the world operate.
Hello and welcome to the Times of India. You're watching Global Pulse with me, Neha Khanna. Recent weeks have witnessed huge tensions between India and the United States thanks to Trump's tariffs. Many have described it as the lowest ebb in ties in 3 decades, though we are now beginning to see a thaw in the bilateral relationship. Domestically, the biggest story in the United States at the moment is the killing of far-right activist and Trump ally Charlie Kirk and its fallout. To talk about the current state of India-US ties and the deep divisions that exist in the United States today, we are now joined by Spencer Critchley, former communication advisor to the 44th US President, Barack Obama. Mr. Spencer Critchley, it's great to have you on Global Pulse. Thanks for joining us.
Pleased to be with you. I just want to start off with a little correction. I was an advisor to both of President Obama's campaigns, but not to him as president.
All right. Let me begin by asking you about the killing of Charlie Kirk and its aftermath in the US. The US appears more divided and polarized today than ever before. How dangerous a place do you think the United States is in today? Is political violence the new normal?
I don't think it's the new normal, but I think we are in a very dangerous situation. Over the years in my work in politics, I've usually found myself in the role of calming people down who don't work in politics and letting them know that no matter how heated it gets in American politics, we're not in danger of a civil war. We're not being taken over by fascists or communists or any of this kind of thing. But now, unfortunately, I believe the news is actually worse than many people appreciate. It's no longer a concern about whether we're on course towards authoritarianism in the United States, for example. We are experiencing it now. We are experiencing the transition between a democracy and a really hollowed out democracy that's becoming a mask for authoritarianism. That's under the leadership of President Trump. At the same time, there's a rise of authoritarianism really on both ends of the spectrum. The authoritarian right is currently in power, led, as I say, by President Trump. There is also a rising authoritarian left. At this point, the authoritarian left is a much smaller force on the very far fringes of the American left. And it really has little to no power and is certainly not at all identical with the Democratic Party or the vast majority of Democrats. But that said, although I believe it's clear that the data shows the problem is currently much worse on the right, including the problem of political violence, we can't overlook the fact that there is a rising tendency on the left to think that political violence is justified, that if you disagree with some opinions, those opinions should be silenced. And this is, all of this is anti-democratic, which means fundamentally that it's anti-American.
All right. You're also recognizing that there's a problem with the far left. Now, Trump and MAGA are repeatedly blaming the left, as you know, for Charlie Kirk's killing. They say it's the violent rhetoric of the left that's responsible. They also, in fact, seem to have blamed the Democratic Party in some ways. What's your response to that?
This, unfortunately, is typical, and it's part of the authoritarian playbook. Trump operates the same way that authoritarian right-wing leaders across the world operate, and the way they have always operated since right-wing authoritarianism became a phenomenon. The left-wing version of authoritarianism has some similarities and some differences. So as part of the right-wing authoritarian playbook, people are either with you or against you. You're always in a struggle against extremely dangerous enemies, and everything is always the fault of your opponents, and the people on your side are always innocent and virtuous. these claims about the Democratic Party are ridiculous to anybody who actually follows the news with any interest in looking for objective facts. But that doesn't matter, because another part of the authoritarian playbook on the right is to live in a world of mythology, and a world in which the truth is determined by the righteous power of your leader. So whatever Trump says is by definition true in that worldview, because he's the leader, and the only reason he's the leader is because he has so much virtue, essentially because God wants him to be the leader. So as a sort of godlike being, everything he says is by definition true, and he can actually just change reality from one day to the next or 1 hour to the next.
Mr. Critchley, what do you think of the fact that the Trump administration and MAGA influencers are baying for the blood of those on the left, even getting people fired from their jobs, in some cases for merely quoting Charlie Kirk and refusing to lionize him? Is free speech a thing of the past in the United States, once the leader of the free world?
I don't think it's a thing of the past, but I think it's very much in danger. And this is a great example. Of course, Trump and his leading supporters, like the late Charlie Kirk, like Elon Musk, are always talking about how they are extremely strong defenders of free speech, and it's the left that's trying to shut down free speech. And that accusation is true of some parts of the left, this extreme fringe, as I say, of the left. But what we see is that when it's speech that they don't like, they are actually exerting the kind of authoritarian repression that is characteristic of dictatorships, like Russia, for example, the former Soviet Union, China, North Korea. We can go down the list. And people who say things that their side doesn't like are not just people they think are wrong, not just people they think are offensive, even, but they're people who are dangerous. And then the rhetoric is that they must be stamped out or eliminated or deported or shut down. And in some cases, yes, that we are at war with these people, which leading figures on the right have been saying. President Trump himself has celebrated political violence. Most notoriously, he incited the attack on the U.S. Capitol and then pardoned or commuted the sentences of every single one of the rioters, including the ones who brutally beat police officers on camera, as the whole world saw. He's the same person who mocked the brutal assault on Nancy Pelosi's husband, which is supposed to be an assassination of Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House. And there's a long list of those incidents. This is an extremely dangerous, or part of this extremely dangerous situation. Now, in some cases, if a private company fires somebody, actually, that's not a violation of free speech. Private companies have broad latitude to choose not to employ people who they feel are damaging the reputation of their company. It becomes a free speech violation when the government controls your speech, when the government arranges for you to be fired. And that, unfortunately, or punished in other ways. And that, unfortunately, is happening every day in the United States now. Again, in full view of the entire world, Trump announces it while he's doing it. He celebrates, the end of the Stephen Colbert show, for example. He's just launched a $15 billion lawsuit of the New York Times following his $10 billion lawsuit against the Washington Post. The Wall Street Journal. These are direct assaults on free speech, and these directly violate the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, really one of the absolute foundation pillars of the United States.
So let me ask you this, Mr. Critchley. Many would say that the United States of America is more divided and polarized today than ever before. You may blame it on President Trump and MAGA, but the larger question is, how does the US emerge from this?
And I don't entirely blame it on President Trump and MAGA. I think that all Americans over time have either helped or allowed the country to get to this state. So no matter how much you oppose President Trump, for example, and what he stands for, and I could not oppose him more. I don't think any violence is justified as part of that opposition, but I could not oppose him more. The fact remains that Americans allowed their democracy to get into a state where a President Trump was possible. And actually, as I argue in the book I wrote about this, I think somebody like President Trump was inevitable sooner or later. That's my book, Patriots of Two Nations. The subtitle is Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next. So the problem really, I think, is a breakdown of the shared understanding of what the United States actually is. And since the founding, really, there have been fundamentally different understandings of what it is. For most of history, Americans have assumed that the United States is defined by a set of ideas. It's not an ethnic homeland the way many other nations are, that, you know, France was originally conceived of as the home of the Franks, and the English was the home of the Anglo-Saxons, etc. The United States is the home of people who believe in freedom, equality, and democracy under the rule of law. And anybody can be an American if they, you know, meet their basic requirements and essentially believe in those values. That's what defines an American. But there's always been a contravening vision of America as something much more like an ethnic homeland. And that's one way of understanding Trumpism versus not just the left, but Trumpism versus liberal democracy, the philosophy on which the country is founded and which is also the foundation of the traditional right and the traditional left.
All right, Mr. Critchley, let's now talk about India-US ties. Now, you know that there has been considerable tension in this relationship thanks to Trump's punitive tariffs and his cabinet members' repeated attacks on India. I wonder how President Obama looks at it. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I don't know personally. You know, I'm not in personal contact with President Obama. I know when you know, people hear that I worked with the Obama campaigns, they often think I was at his elbow, directly whispering in his ear all the time. And no, I was one of many consultants helping the campaigns. And yes, I was with Obama, but I don't want to mislead people about you know, the importance of my role doing that. There were many other people who had more important roles. That said, I would imagine that President Obama is disturbed to see what's happening, as I would imagine former President Bush is disturbed, and former President Clinton, and many other president and former senior officials from both parties. As you know, the effort to bring the United States and India together has been a project of decades. As a matter of self-interest on both sides, of course, and as is well understood from the American perspective and from the Indian perspective, I believe, part of the attraction there is to be in an alliance against any potential threat from China that goes beyond the normal kind of competition that we should welcome in international relations. But also because both countries were founded as democracies, and it's certainly part of the American vision for its own future and its hopes for the future of the world, that democracies have good, strong relationships with each other and help each other to thrive as democracies. Now, that's been, you know, as I say, the work of decades. A lot of very hard work has gone into that in both countries. It hasn't always been easy, and it doesn't by any means mean that both countries are always going to agree about everything. But both sides have seen it, I believe, and certainly on the American side, as an extremely valuable and important relationship. And in my opinion, Donald Trump just impulsively trashed it because he got angry at Prime Minister Modi. And I actually think that the claim that it's over Russian oil purchases, while I actually myself have objections to those purchases, I don't think that's actually the reason. I think it's just Trump was annoyed personally one day, and he decided to take it out by jacking up these sanctions and jeopardizing an extremely important bilateral relationship.